Okay, right. Platyhelminthes, the flatworms, includes many free-living members, but there's also two of the major groups of animal parasites. That would be the flukes or the digenea and the tapeworms. Sorry, I thought I heard something go beep. As well as a couple of groups that are of somewhat less diverse and probably a bit less important from the human point of view, but that nonetheless are, interesting and, important for getting the full story. Okay, I don't see anything, so let's roll on. And the Platyhelminthes are part of one of those four big superphyla of the protostomes. Remember that animals that are not sponges or jellyfish are put in a big group called the Bilateria, the two-sided animals. And those you can divide into protostomes and deuterostomes. Deuterostomes would be chordates and echinoderms and a couple others, and we've covered those. Pretty much all we're going to cover in this course. Protostomes would be lophophorates, which don't have any parasitic members that I know of. Trochozoa, which would include segmented worms and mollusks, snails and clams and such. And then the two groups with the most parasitic members would be Platyzoa and Ecdysozoa. This is all in Monday's lecture. Ecdysozoa are organisms that molt, and that would be arthropods and roundworms, plus some others that we won't really get into much here. Platyzoa, most of these guys are small. The parasitic members can get quite large, but most of the free-living platyzoans aren't very big. Many, but not all, have teeth of some sort. And usually there's a reduced coelom or no coelom. What's a coelom? A coelom is a fluid-filled cavity in the body, and the gut and other organs are usually suspended in the coelom. It's an empty space. It isolates the gut from the movement of the body wall, so that if you're a worm, you can wriggle without it affecting what your gut muscles are doing to push food through. In you, your coelom's divided into three cavities: the peritoneal cavity around your heart, the pleural cavity, or cavities, there's two, the pleural cavities around your lungs, and the peritoneal cavity around your intestines and liver and stomach and all of that. You don't have a lot of open space. Your guts fill your peritoneum pretty tightly. But still, if you've ever heard of somebody's appendix rupturing and they get peritonitis, that's an infection of the lining of the peritoneal cavity, which is part of your coelom. And I mention this because platyzoans typically either have a very small one or they don't have any at all. In Platyhelminthes, the body is basically solid tissue except for the gut. The gut is the only open space in the body. Well, except for the ones that don't even have a gut, but we'll get to that soon enough. There's lots of free-living Platyhelminthes, but also those big parasite groups. A second phylum that we'll hit next week is called the Acanthocephala. Well, they used to be considered a phylum. They're now known to be an unusual subgroup of a larger grouping called the Rotifera. We'll get to those guys in time. We'll briefly look at a weird little group called the Mesozoa that infests marine invertebrates and have very strange anatomy. We'll talk about those in good time. And there's other platyzoan phyla that you can learn about in Invertzo if you really want to, but they're not parasites. They don't contain any parasitic members. So what's special about the Platyhelminthes? They're acoelomate, which means there's no body cavity except for the gut. There's a gut and there's a gut wall, but then the gut wall is right next to other cells that just make up the mass of the body. There's no space between the body wall, and the gut. The gut has only one opening. The way out is the way in. In small species, the gut might be just a little bag. In large ones, the gut's often branched very highly. And then in things like tapeworms, there is no gut, but we'll get to that. In at least some stages of the life cycle, there's ciliated epidermis. The outer layer of cells is covered with little cilia, hairs that beat back and forth. In the parasitic ones, they only have this at one particular stage of the life cycle, but they've all got it at least part of the life cycle. These are typically hermaphroditic, meaning that they've got functional ovaries and testes in the same individual. Some can self-fertilize, but they'll usually copulate and fertilize internally instead of firing off clouds of eggs and sperm the way a lot of marine invertebrates do. They'll generally pair up, and they may be hermaphroditic, but often each one will donate sperm to the other. And then there's those beautiful pseudobicerous marine flatworms that mate by a behavior called penis fencing, which I don't have time to explain, but you ought to look it up sometime. Oh, and there's also lots of stem cells throughout life. Free-living flatworms are famous for their ability to regenerate after you've cut them. There are some free-living flatworms that routinely reproduce asexually just by budding off new individuals. As we'll see, this plays an important role in the parasitic ones as well, the ability to regenerate and make new individuals because they've got these stem cells throughout life. We used to classify these as a mostly free-living group called Turbellaria. This would include the planaria worms that you might have seen in 1441. They're pretty common in biology classes. With any luck, we'll see some tomorrow, and we can take at least a brief look at free-living Turbellarian platyhelminthes. And then the major parasitic groups would be monogeneans, Trematoda, and Cestoda. The trematodes includes the flukes. The cestodes includes tapeworms. The monogenea are a small group of parasites that mostly parasitizes fish, although a few of them show up in turtles, frogs, and hippopotamus eye sockets. That's the way we used to do this. We now know that Turbellaria is paraphyletic, and we encounter that term when talking about the protists, if you recall. A paraphyletic group consists of some descendants of a common ancestor, but not all descendants of a common ancestor. So the protista is paraphyletic because the last common ancestor of all protists was also the common ancestor of animals, plants, and fungi. And the last common ancestor of all of what we call Turbellaria was also a common ancestor of all of the parasite groups as well. Turbellaria is still used as an informal name for free-living flatworms. It comes from the same root as turbulence, because when you see one of these crawling around under the microscope, the beating of their cilia often kicks up little particles, kind of like, a crowd kicking up dust. So the term is still kind of used informally, but it's no longer used as a formal class. How you do divide these up is a fairly complicated affair, and we're not going to treat it in detail. Turns out that the major parasitic groups do belong in one single clade, one single descendant of a common ancestor called the Neodermata, the ones with new skin. Neo, new, derma, skin. You probably know that. That being said, there are some flatworms that are parasitic, but not in the Neodermata. Neodermata isn't defined by being parasitic. It's defined by developing a new type of epidermis, which is where the name new skin comes from. And I'll show you that in just a bit. So if we look at a recent cladogram, okay, the last common ancestor of all Platyhelminthes is over at the upper left, that little, box labeled with an X up there. And you can see there are, what, catenulids, macron, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There's 11 major groups of flatworms, not counting the Neodermata. We're not going to worry about the distinctions between catenulids and macrostomomorphs and polyclads and all that. We're not going to worry about that here. The major parasite groups are in that red box down below, the red box that encloses members of this group called the Neodermata. There's a tapeworm, a monogenean, and a fluke in that red box as examples. All of the others are outside that red box, and you can see that they don't form a monophyletic group. Their last common ancestor was also the ancestor of the neodermates. You can also see every one of those boxes that's green is enclosing a taxa that has some members that are parasitic. So the major parasitic groups are in the red box, but there are also some parasites in the green boxes as well. So Neodermata is not defined by being parasitic. It is defined by having this unique type of epidermis, which we will get to. Okay, right. So free-living flatworms have the ciliated epidermis. It's 1 cell thick. Microturbularians just means small flatworms, and they can generally just glide on their cilia. Macroturbularians just means ones that are big, and they'll usually assist their cilia with moving their muscles, and some can even swim. There's some very large marine big flatworms that can flap the body. One you might look up is called the Spanish dancer, because when it swims, it looks like a Spanish flamenco dancer, swinging her ruffled skirts around. At least it does if you're on drugs. There's a lot of funky glands in the epidermis for mucus. There's bodies in the epidermis that are shaped like rods, and they're called rhabdites. The space between the body wall and the gut is full of loosely packed cells called parenchyma, and there's a pretty complex system of muscles. We won't say that much about these guys, but just for some illustration, that's a small free-living flatworm that's had its muscle system stained, and it looks almost like a Scottish tartan. What you can see is the head is at the right, the tail is at the left. The bands of muscle that run from head to tail are called longitudinal muscles. The ones at right angles are called circular muscles, and then at 45-degree angles, you have diagonal muscles. That allows for some fairly sophisticated muscle movements. And I just heard a ding-dong, so we'll pause for a moment while I see what that is. Okay, welcome, welcome. Did you get kicked out and are coming back, or, well, never mind, it's not critical. Glad you're with us. Right. Okay, so pretty sophisticated muscular system. Free-living ones have a fairly sophisticated nervous system. If you must know, the fancy name for this type of nervous system is orthogon, which is Greek, I think, for right angle. Ortho meaning straight, and gon being one of the words for angle, because it's shaped like a ladder. You've got 2 main nerve cords running to a brain up at the head end that may have eyes or other sense organs there. And the two main nerve cords are connected by nerves called commissures, which make the whole thing look like a ladder. The commissures being the rungs of the ladder and the main nerve cords forming the sides. So in the free-living ones, it's pretty sophisticated. Parasites, not so much. The gut in microscopic flatworms may be nearly straight. That's a very small rhabdocele flatworm, and that thing that looks like kind of an orange rod right down the center of the body, that's the gut. And then those spheres on either side of the body happen to be eggs. Flatworms tend to lay pretty large eggs with lots of yolk. There's a much larger species on the right. That's an Indian Ocean marine species called aquaplana. And you can see that there's this lacy, delicate, almost moss-looking stuff growing through the body. The main gut is that white thing in the dead center of the body, but branches of the gut form that mossy-looking network that runs throughout the body and transport nutrients to every cell. There's no real need for a circulatory system, but branches of the gut suffice to get nutrients to every cell. And then most of the cells can take up oxygen directly from the environment because the worm is so flat. Lots of surface area for gas exchange here. Probably the most famous free-living flatworm is Dugezia, the freshwater planarian worm. You've probably seen this guy before. I know Steve Carafit often orders these for, I think, 1441, so I don't know if he still does, but I'm hoping many of you have seen planaria worms before. Pretty good eyes up at the front, up at the top left. You can see they look crossed. And in this particular one, the gut has been injected with dark red dye. The mouth is actually on a muscular tube in the middle of the body. And there's one branch of the gut that runs from there to the head, and then two that branch off and run towards the posterior end on the left side and the right side. This belongs to a subgroup called the Tricladida. That's just Greek for three branches, because the gut's got three branches, one to the head and two going posterior down the left and the right. Here's another triclad called Bdelliura. It seems to be a commensal, not a parasite, but it likes hanging out on the gills of horseshoe crabs. Mostly feeds on food particles that the horseshoe crab leaves behind. And again, seems to be more of a commensal than a parasite. Again, the mouth is more or less in the center of the body on a muscular tube that can be protruded. Here it's kind of retracted. And you can see that one main branch going to the head with, of course, a lot of side branches. And then two branches going to the posterior by left and by right. And the posterior end here has been modified into a sucker. So this one is not a major parasite, but it is a commensal, and it might give you an idea of what early stages in a parasitic relationship might look like. There's a whole class of turbularians that are either parasitic or commensal, mostly on crustaceans. They're called temnocephalids, and they've got kind of lumpy bodies and tentacles on the anterior end. I will include a link to it. There's actually some YouTube video of temnocephalids crawling around. They look kind of cute. Another group called the Ficampiids is not a neodermaton group, but it's got parasitic members. This one is considered a threat to the cultured mussel industry. Not muscle as in what you flex, but mussel as in edible type of clams. This one is a parasite on clam gills. You are probably not personally concerned with the mussel culture industry, but somebody's, it's helping to feed the world and helping to earn money for people. So for people in that industry, it's a potential threat. Eurostoma cyprinae. There's Eurostoma cyprinae reproducing. It normally lives on clam gills. When it crawls out, it forms a cocoon around itself and lays eggs that develop into larvae. And those smaller spots with two black eyes that you see surrounding the big one, kind of up to the upper right, those are larval Eurostoma cyprinae. So there. There's another really weird one called Kronborgia that's a parasite of crustaceans. This is a North Atlantic shrimp. Down in the lower picture, labeled B, the carapace has been removed, and the cephalothorax, the, quote, head of the shrimp, is largely occupied with this thing that looks a little like a brain. That's the worm. That's Kronborgia. Kronborgia has a nasty trick that a lot of parasitic flatworms do, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's called parasitic castration. They'll often go right for the gonads and eat them. And Kronborgia does this. Okay, so those are parasitic members of what we used to call free-living groups. But the big hitters in the platyhelminthes, as far as parasites go, share a feature in common. There is a stage in the life cycle where they have a ciliated epidermis like their planaria worm cousins, but they'll develop a secondary epidermis that doesn't have cilia, and the secondary epidermis is syncytial, and that's a word you do need to know because we're going to see it again. A syncytium is like a cell with multiple nuclei. So certain types of slime mold are free-living syncytia because they consist of basically a great big blob of cytoplasm with one membrane and maybe thousands of nuclei in it. You can have a syncytium when the nucleus of a cell divides, but the rest of the cell doesn't. So if you have mitosis without cytokinesis, you can have a syncytium, or you can have it when separate cells fuse. You may have two cells with one nucleus that just come together and make a cell with two nuclei. That's a syncytium. And there's a number of members of the animal kingdom that have one, but that syncytial epidermis is what defines the neodermata. That's what the name refers to, the ones with new skin, because they develop this unique epidermis that other flatworms don't. And we classify these guys now into Trematoda and Circomeromorpha. Trematoda includes the flukes, which are in a group called the Digenea, and we'll start getting into those guys on Friday. And a small group we'll look at briefly today called the Aspidobothria, which isn't all that diverse. There's about 80 known species, and they're not particularly bad parasites as far as harming the host, and they don't parasitize anything that is of too great concern to humans. Not that that's a measure of how worthy a living thing is, but it is true that if you go on to vet school, you're never going to find Aspidobothrians parasitizing your cows or anything like that. At least I hope not. That would be freaking weird. Anyway, we'll cover those briefly today. The other group, Circomeromorpha, includes Monogenoidea, which is a group of external parasites that mostly hit fish and turtles and things like that. There are some that cause problems for the fish culturing industry, particularly salmon. And then the Cestoidea includes the true tapeworms and some kin. And the flukes and the tapeworms are big groups that we do need to spend a lot of time on because they can infect all kinds of vertebrates, including humans and including species of, veterinary importance as well. These are things that you'll see down the road. This is a cross-section. It's based on electron microscope pictures taken through the epidermis of a tapeworm, and that epidermis is also called the tegument. Now, what you're looking at is the cells that make this up are internal. They're called cytons, which I always thought were the bad guys in Battlestar Galactica, but evidently not. You'll also see them called pericarya, and they are inside the body underneath the layers of muscle. But what they'll do is that as the worm matures, it'll shuck its ciliated epidermis, and the cytons will send out projections that grow up through the muscles, spread out over the surface of the body, and then fuse to form a syncytium. So the outermost layer is made up of these projections that push up from below, spread out, join with each other, and form this continuous covering of the body, the syncytium. So the actual nuclei are kind of protected down there in the cytons, and then the entire body is covered by this continuous layer made up of fused projections from the cytons. In tapeworms, by the way, the outside looks like velvet because it's covered with little hair-like structures called microtrichs. We'll see those later. They increase the surface area that's available for food absorption because tapeworms absorb through the body wall because they have no gut. They probably also help the worm stick to the gut wall. But you don't see those microtrichs in flukes or anything like that. And there's another diagram of the basic arrangement. You can see the cytons or the pericarya on the left. They've sent up these extensions that penetrate through the muscle layers and spread out once they're on the surface and form this continuous sheet of cytoplasm all around the body. That's that syncytial epidermis, aka the tegument. What's on the surface looks a little bit different in different groups. Tapeworms have those microtrichs, others don't. Digeneans have little granules below the surface, others don't. But the same fundamental structure is found in all of these groups. One of the reasons why this is adaptive for a parasitic lifestyle is if you had an epidermis made of cells, those cells have to stick together somewhere. And if they stick together somewhere, that creates a potential weak spot for the host's immune defenses to penetrate. Think about, imagine like a brick wall gets hit by something. Could be a wrecking ball like Miley Cyrus. Could be a drunk driver like this guy I remember who knocked over one of the stacks of brick at our campus entrance back about 18 years ago. Think about a brick wall getting hit. Where it's going to break is probably along the mortar, right? Where the bricks join the mortar, that's natural weak spots. And if you have a worm with separate epidermal cells, then possibly your white blood cells, which can squeeze through very small gaps, might be able to force their way through. Or maybe antibodies could get in or something like that. What makes these successful as parasites is that with this syncytial epidermis, there aren't any cell junctions. There aren't any weak spots. It's like a wall poured out of solid concrete instead of made of bricks and mortar. There aren't any natural weak zones where the immune system might be able to attack. And you'll see this basic idea in other groups of parasites as well. So remember that word, syncytium. Right. Got nothing to do with that super violent comic book, by the way. That was Sin City. Okay, why is my slide not advancing? Whoops. Now, why is it doing that? Okay, there. Okay, trematodes, the first big subdivision of the neodermates, are endoparasites. They're either inside tissues or they're inside blood. Mostly inside tissues like the lungs, the liver, the bile duct. We will see some important ones that are blood parasites. They can attach to tissues because they've got suckers, one around the mouth and one on the belly, on the ventral side. And usually the life cycle involves multiple hosts. Typically, although you'll see some exceptions, the intermediate host, where there's asexual reproduction taking place, is a mollusk, very often a snail, as hopefully we will see tomorrow. And the definitive host where sexual reproduction happens is a vertebrate. You can find some exceptions to that rule. The Digenea have an asexual reproductive stage in the intermediate host. That's the flukes. That's the one we're going to focus on starting with tomorrow's lab. To fill out the time, we'll cover a small subgroup of the trematodes called the Aspidobothrians, which don't have an asexual reproductive stage. And these are not commonly seen unless you go out looking for them. And as I've said, Aspidobothrians don't parasitize anything that most people care about, but, you know, they're still part of the picture, you know, a branch on the great tree of life. So we should cover them. You'll also see them called Aspidogastria. If you're curious as to what the name means, aspis is Greek for a shield. Aspidogastria means shield on the stomach. Bothro is Greek for a pit or a ditch. So Aspidobothria means shield with ditches, and you'll see why in just a minute, why they're called shields with ditches. It's not a big group. None are known to be of economic importance. There is a sucker around the mouth. These feed directly, unlike tapeworms, which absorb through the skin. These feed with mouths and guts. There's a sucker around the mouth and a large attachment organ on the ventral side. Usually that is a big ventral sucker. Much more rarely, it might be several individual suckers. In one, it's actually not suckers, but a bunch of folds called rugae. But typically, you have a big ventral sucker. There's a fairly complex nervous system. They don't ever reproduce asexually. They're not very host-specific, and some of them can survive for very long periods outside a host. One of the species that I'll show you can live up to 5 weeks when you remove it from its natural habitat in clam hearts. So this suggests that in some sense they represent an intermediate between free-living and parasitic lifestyles. They are parasitic, but they can live for long times on their own. They're not tightly adapted to any one particular host. So they're parasites, but they're not really, 100% committed. They're just kind of trying out the lifestyle to see if they like it. And there's one, Cotylogaster. The picture up at the top, you see the belly, the ventral side, and you can now see why they're called Aspidobothria, shield with ditches or shield with trenches, because that big oval muscular sucker is divided up into a bunch of compartments by low cross walls called septa. If you must know, the compartments are called alveoli, or they're called loculi. Both of those pictures, you can see that big sucker with lots of alveoli. And on the one below, picture 2, the lower picture, the mouth is at the lower left, and it's surrounded by a funnel-like opening called the buccal funnel. Buccal has to do with your mouth or your cheeks. Buccal funnel is the funnel of the cheeks, I guess. That sounds kind of funny, but there you go. So you can see that funnel-like tube surrounding the mouth to the lower left. There's a diagram of one that shows you the anatomy. Aspidogaster conchicola. I don't know if I will be able to do it in this week's lab, but Hufflepuffs, it kind of depends on water levels in the creeks around here. But Hufflepuffs, I might try to collect some freshwater mussels and see if I can find any of these. I've never done this before. It might be interesting to try. So we might open up some freshwater clams. This parasitizes a lot of different clam species and is sometimes also found in turtles and fish. So there you've got the idea that, you know, these are not very tightly adapted to any one particular host. So they're not very good at this parasite thing just yet. Figure A on the left, that is an external drawing of the ventral side, and you can see that big sucker with the septa and the alveoli, those little rectangles. And then B is drawn from the dorsal side up on the top, and you can see the organs. You can see the mouth is at the top in that funnel, and it opens into a simple blind pouch that goes about 3/4 of the way down the body. Just looks like a big sac. To the sides of the gut, there's a pair of organs called vitellaria. They secrete egg yolk. One thing that comes up in flatworm classification is, you know, in chickens, if you think about it, the yolk is inside the egg. Yolk is present in the egg from the moment that it's made in the ovaries. And then when an egg is laid, it passes through, right, the chicken's oviduct, and then the shell gets plastered on later. In many flatworms, the egg is formed in the ovaries, and then the yolk gets plastered on later. So if the yolk is always part of the egg, it's called endolecithal. And if the yolk is plastered on after the egg is formed, the species is called ectolecithal. Ecto from the outside, lecithal has to do with yolk. So these guys are ectolecithal, and most, if not all, flukes that I can think of are ectolecithal, and they have these separate yolk glands that smear the egg with lots of yolk after the egg is formed. So the eggs are formed in the ovary, which is anterior. It's in the midline about 1/3 of the way down. Eggs pass through this looping structure that goes all the way to the posterior. That's the uterus. And as it passes through the uterus, yolk is made in the vitellaria and gets plastered onto the egg, and then the egg passes out of the body. A lot of classification of flatworms has to do with details of the reproductive system. Many of them don't consist of much else but reproductive system. Remember that parasites in general tend to de-emphasize features that free-living organisms need and make up for it by cranking out babies like you wouldn't believe. One of the few that doesn't have a ventral sucker is called Rugogaster. It attaches to its host just by these folds called rugae, right? They make the thing look a little bit like an accordion. And the natural habitat of Rugogaster is the rectal gland of Pacific chimeras. Chimeras are this group of fish that are related to sharks, but not in the sharks themselves. They look kind of weird and funny. A common name for them is rabbitfish. They tend to live in the deep ocean and are not as well known as other species of chondrichthyien. But here we have a worm that lives up their rectal glands because somebody has to, right? You can't have a niche without something exploiting it, because other than that, where would you be? If we're going to have parasitic worms that live in hippopotamus eye sockets, we have to have worms that live in chimera fish rectal glands, because otherwise, what's the point of life? There may be an intermediate host required, but we don't know much about this guy. It's not that easy to study Pacific chimera rectal glands. You can't just order them from Carolina Biological Supply when you want them. The life cycle could basically be described as whatever. Some species have only one host. They're monoxenous. They'll go from one mollusk to another mollusk. The ones that parasitize vertebrates probably have mollusks as an intermediate host. We don't know of any species that can go from one vertebrate to another. Some have so little host specificity that they don't care. They can reach maturity in either a mollusk or a vertebrate. Like, hey, man, whatever. And as I mentioned, some species can survive in water or saline for many days. That one that I showed you earlier can live up to 5 weeks in saline or 2 weeks in pond water, which suggests again that Aspidobothrians are not really 100% down with this parasite thing. They're not as tightly adapted to a parasitic lifestyle as the flukes and tapeworms that we'll see. And the eggs hatch into larvae that swim with tufts of cilia that look like this. They're sometimes called Cotylocydia larvae. They're covered in cilia. They've got a big posterior sucker. They'll penetrate a new host, get rid of the cilia, and grow that new epidermis because they're neodermates. And that big posterior sucker, the thing on the hind end that looks like a big donut, grows larger and it starts forming alveoli. And that's all we got time for as far as Aspidobothrians go. Friday, we will start covering the flukes. And those do infect humans, millions of them worldwide. They are important parasites of livestock animals. And there's a lot more, they're much more diverse, and there's a lot that needs to be known about them. Okay, I will go ahead and stop.